Welcome back to the deep dive. This is where we, try to streamline the complexity, filter out the noise, and really just hand you the knowledge that matters. And today we are taking a long, hard look at one of the most, well, frustrating and complicated relationships in modern geopolitics. We're talking about the United States and Venezuela. Okay, so let's unpack this. We're dealing with a dynamic that's just saturated with high-stakes politics, heavy financial sanctions, a massive humanitarian crisis, and at its core, oil. The tension's been constant, but the methods for dealing with it are now showing some really dramatic, cautious shifts.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if you look at where we are now, here in 2025, the relationship is still defined by this deep mistrust. But the strategic calculus in Washington is changing. The sources all indicate we're moving away from that rigid maximum pressure doctrine towards something that you could really only call calculated, cautious diplomacy.
And that's the core of our mission today. We want to help you, the listener, understand the primary drivers behind this pivot. What are the trade-offs Washington is making between, promoting political change and stabilizing global markets? Because this isn't just about Caracas anymore. It's about global stability.
Precisely. And to understand the present, we really have to start with the past. Specifically, the decade of sanctions that shaped Venezuela's economic collapse.
Let's start exactly there. Sanctions. They've been the main U.S. tool for years. The stated goal was political reform, but, the analysts all suggest they failed to achieve regime change. So what was the specific structure? How did they achieve all this pressure, but so little political leverage?
Well, the initial goal was meant to be surgical, targeting specific individuals, corruption, that sort of thing. But by 2017, and then especially 2019, the U.S. Treasury, through OFAC, it moved toward these crippling sectoral sanctions. And this is where the technical detail really matters. They essentially cut off the government's access to the U.S. financial system.
So no more servicing debt.
Exactly. Impossible. And crucially, they restricted PDVSA, the state oil company, from accessing the U.S. market. The idea was to apply a tourniquet to the cash flow, assuming the pressure would force some kind of swift political concession. But here's that dual impact you see in the sources. Access to capital evaporated, sure, but the government proved highly resistant. The consequence was a massive, just undeniable humanitarian toll.
Right. And humanitarian toll almost undersells it. We're talking about a complete collapse of public services, health infrastructure, supply chains for, basic necessities.
Right.
The sanctions were a blunt instrument that just hammered ordinary citizens, reinforcing the very crisis Washington said it was trying to fix.
Exactly. And the failure of maximum pressure to deliver that political surrender, combined with the humanitarian disaster, is what's fueling this notable shift now. It's a pragmatic pivot at the end of the day.
What's fascinating here is the motivation. It isn't just a political change of heart. The sources suggest the drivers are incredibly pragmatic, driven by events far outside Venezuela.
Oh, they absolutely are. The key drivers are, first, urgent U.S. energy security concerns, especially with the volatility after the conflict in Ukraine and, broader tensions in the Middle East. Washington realized that pulling even a small amount of Venezuelan crude back into the global market could help stabilize prices. It gives the U.S. flexibility.
And what about regional stability?
That's the other piece. A completely collapsing state on the cusp of South America is it's too great a risk. You have mass destabilization, criminal networks, not to mention the unchecked migration, which has become a huge domestic political issue for the U.S.
So it sounds like Washington is making a tough trade-off, kind of sacrificing the pure democratic messaging for geopolitical stability and, frankly, lower gas prices. Let's pivot directly to energy then, because you can't analyze this without talking about crude oil. Venezuela is famously sitting on top of the world's largest proven oil reserves. It's an economic superpower just waiting to be repaired.
The potential is staggering. We're talking around 300 billion barrels. That's significantly more than Saudi Arabia. But, as the saying goes, having it and getting it out of the ground are two very different things. And this is where it gets a bit technical. Most Venezuelan oil is overwhelmingly heavy crude. To move it, to refine it, you need vast quantities of light oil or condensate. These are called diluents. Because of sanctions, PDVSA has struggled intensely to get these diluents, meaning billions of barrels of their heaviest crude are literally stuck in the ground or in storage, just coagulating.
So the reserves are massive, but the infrastructure to actually get it and process it is fundamentally broken. Lack of maintenance, lack of diluents, and, of course, mismanagement. What does that decline look like in hard numbers?
The decline is catastrophic. A decade ago, Venezuela was pumping well over 3 million barrels a day.
3 million, wow.
right? And now production is usually somewhere between 700,000 and 800,000 barrels a day. It's a drop of over 70%. And analysts agree sanctions were the accelerator, but the underlying diseases were long-term corruption and no capital reinvestment.
Which brings us to a very complex question. Is the U.S. still buying Venezuelan oil right now? And if it is, how does that possibly square with the sanctions?
That's a really important question, and the nuance here is everything. The U.S. sanctions regime isn't a full embargo, it's a system of licensing. Since 2022, and with recent extensions, the Treasury has issued specific general licenses.
So like special permissions.
Exactly. The most notable one allows specific energy companies like Chevron to operate limited joint ventures in Venezuela. But here's the critical part. They're primarily allowed to lift crude to recover outstanding debt that PDVSA owes them. The oil they ship goes to the U.S. or global markets, but technically is debt repayment, not as direct cash flow to the government's coffers, this very tightly controlled valve.
Ah, so it's a mechanism to let companies recover their losses and inject just enough crude into the global market to provide some relief, all while keeping the pressure framework in place. A carefully measured release.
Precisely. And if you look at the global supply implications, this is the main lever Venezuela still has. Analysts estimate that if sanctions were fully lifted, and with enough foreign investment, Venezuela could potentially ramp up production by hundreds of thousands of barrels a day within a year or two. That won't solve global energy prices on its own, but it's a substantial stabilizing factor. And that's why Washington is willing to play this licensing game.
That economic engine, even broken as it is clearly driving foreign policy. But its collapse has had a profoundly human cost. We need to shift focus now to the humanitarian crisis, which the sources describe as one of the largest displacement crises in the Western Hemisphere's recent history.
The scale is.
Yeah.
It's staggering, and it really demands attention. We are talking about over 7.7 million people who have fled Venezuela. To give you some context, that rivals the displacement numbers from crises like Syria.
That's incredible.
It is, and these people are escaping a brutal combination of things. Hyperinflation that made their money worthless, the total breakdown of civil services, and entrenched political repression. They're not moving for opportunity. They're moving out of just existential desperation.
And when you have an exodus of that size, it immediately destabilizes the entire region. The problem doesn't just stop at the Venezuelan border.
That's a crucial point. Colombia, Peru, Ecuador, they've borne the brunt of this influx. It's strained their social infrastructure, their schools, their health systems severely. So the U.S. response has been twofold, providing aid to those neighboring countries to help them manage the crisis regionally, but also dealing with the increasingly political challenge of migrants traveling north to the U.S. border.
So how has Washington navigated that domestic political tightrope with this influx of Venezuelans coming into the U.S.?
It's been a very contentious and shifting landscape. On one hand, the U.S. has used humanitarian tools like temporary protected status, TPS, which allows Venezuelans already here to work legally and avoid deportation. It acknowledges the reality of the crisis.
But on the other hand,
the administration has used restrictive border policies, sometimes even methods like Title 42, to manage the flow and try to deter more people from coming north. This mix of humanitarian relief and strict border enforcement just highlights how politically sensitive the issue is in Washington. Any change in policy is immediately scrutinized from both sides, making a comprehensive long-term solution incredibly challenging to pull off.
it seems like the U.S. is trying to isolate Caracas, but at the same time, it's trying to manage the immense collateral damage from that isolation. But we know the U.S. isn't the only global player here. It's not happening in a vacuum. Other major powers are actively complicating this strategy. Let's broaden our view. Which countries are not just observers, but active influences, basically providing a lifeline to Caracas?
This is where it gets really interesting because the U.S. policy of isolation is constantly being countered by geopolitical rivals. They're turning Venezuela into a kind of proxy zone. The key nations are Russia, China, and Iran. They ensure the sanctions never fully achieve their goal.
So let's break that down. What's China's role?
China's primary influence is through debt. Venezuela owes China tens of billions of dollars, and Beijing often refinances or restructures this through oil-for-loan deals. This gives Caracas immediate financial relief, even if it's debt-laden, without needing Western capital markets.
Yeah, and Russia. We always hear about a military connection there.
Russia is primarily involved in strategic support, defense, the oil sector. They've provided arms and military training, and Russian energy giants have helped lift Venezuelan crude, often acting as crucial intermediaries, making sure Caracas still has pathways for trade, even with U.S. scrutiny.
And then there's Iran, which is dealing with its own severe sanctions, so they're actively involved in Venezuela's oil sector now. That feels like a direct challenge to U.S. policy.
It is a deliberate challenge, absolutely. Iran has been critical in providing technical expertise and materials to repair Venezuela's severely damaged refineries. Remember those die loans we mentioned? Iran has shipped vital components and skilled engineers to help PDVSA get key facilities back online. This tangible, specialized support significantly complicates U.S. efforts to bring the oil sector to a standstill. It's a clear synergy between two heavily sanctioned states.
So if these major players are providing economic, military, and technical lifelines, U.S. sanctions are less of a total blockade and more of an inconvenient, leaky barrier. This turns the whole thing into a much broader, multipolar chess game.
It absolutely does.
Yeah.
The U.S. can't isolate